In this video, I'll provide an overview of our discussion board for creating and conducting a hypothesis test. So here we are on our homepage, and as usual, I'll click on the weekly modules to go into our course. But if you want to just get to the discussion board real quick, you can always use the discussion link on the left side of Canvas. So in the week 6 module for chapter 9, the video you're watching right now is this link right here, and I'll go ahead and click on the discussion board 4 link and walk you through it. One of the main purposes of statistics is to test a hypothesis, which is an idea or assumption about something in the world around you. So make sure to read chapter 9 first before attempting this assignment so that you have a conceptual understanding as you go through this process. For your project, you have the option of doing a hypothesis test of a mean or a hypothesis test of a proportion. Within this discussion board, I have examples of both. You only have to do one for the project, but are welcome to do both if you'd like the extra practice. Now remember that your sample data is the Airbnb data from your city. The population or hypothesized values can come from your secondary research data, such as the internet. It can be a conservative number of your choice, or it can be based on expert opinion. And I'll give you an example of these shortly. I've also created a inferential statistics worksheet that will guide your hypothesis test process. And I have videos below that will show you how to use the worksheet. But just so you can see what the worksheet looks like, in the top half of the document is the instructions for a hypothesis test of a population mean. And then if you scroll down, in the second half of the worksheet is a hypothesis test for a population proportion. You just want to make sure you know the difference between a mean and a proportion, and then choose the appropriate section of the worksheet to fill out. I also recommend using this when you're doing the homework because it's the same rules or instructions for proportions and for means. So it's a good reference document. For your original post, you will share your hypothesis test calculations and results following the structure of my examples provided below. Now, make sure to include the components of your hypothesis test. This will allow me and your peers to verify your hypothesis test is correct and give you good feedback. In addition, you need to explain the implications or the so what of your findings. In other words, how are the results of your hypothesis test useful to make decisions for your business? You want to be specific about the decisions you are making based on your analyses. Again, this will let you practice using real-world data to make real-world decisions for your pretend business. For your peer post, after reading and reviewing someone else's original post, you're going to check their hypothesis test. You'll want to check how they set it up, their calculations, as well as their interpretations and decisions based on the hypothesis test. Now, if their hypothesis test is correct, tell them so. But if you notice any errors or mistakes, give them some feedback and correct it for them. So for instance, maybe they set up their hypothesis test incorrectly, or they found the wrong critical value, or they calculated the test statistic incorrectly. Perhaps their interpretation is a bit off, whether they're using the critical value method or the p-value method, or perhaps they interpreted the so what or the business implications and their decisions don't really make sense. So you're welcome to comment on more than one peer post, but try to comment on someone who hasn't received any feedback yet, and as an incentive to practice checking hypothesis tests. If you find an error in someone's post and you correct it, I will offer 5 extra credit points. I will also be verifying everyone's hypothesis tests and providing feedback directly into the discussion boards so that we can all learn from one another's post. So let's go and scroll down and look at some examples. So here is the example for a hypothesis test of a population mean. I'm interested in testing the average price per night of a neighborhood called Villa Marie within Montreal. Specifically, I want to know if Villa Marie is greater or less than $120 per night. So where did I get that hypothesized mean of $120 though? It does not come from the Airbnb data. It came from a secondary source. I searched online and found the Travel Budget Montreal website that suggested it costs about $120 per night for accommodations in the city of Montreal. This is the number that I'm going to use for my null and alternative hypotheses down below. This information from the internet becomes my idea or assumption about the world that I'm going to test to see if it's true or not. Now, alternatively, you can pick a conservative number, but you just have to explain why. So maybe you choose $150 per night as your hypothesized value because that's your typical budget when you or others travel. Or maybe you're more of a frugal traveler, and so your budget is something less than, like $100 per night. Or maybe you want to pick a hypothesized mean based on some expert opinion, like a frequent traveler. So perhaps you know someone that has been to the city or goes to the city often, and you can ask them what the typical cost per night is and then use that number. So here is my null and alternative hypotheses. The null is what I'm going to assume is true unless I have evidence from our Airbnb data that suggests otherwise. So my null hypothesis states that the hypothesized population mean is equal to $120 per night. And my alternative hypothesis states that the hypothesized population mean is not $120 per night. And it's also helpful to explain why I'm doing this hypothesis test. Again, I want to market my bike tour for wine bars and breweries in an upscale neighborhood. And I think Ville Marie might fit that description. So I need to test it and see how it compares to Montreal as a whole. That's why the 120 is based off of Montreal, the city. And what I'm trying to see is Ville Marie the same as Montreal as a whole, or maybe it's greater than or less than. And testing it will let me know one way or another. From here, I'll go ahead and run my hypothesis test, and you can watch the video here that'll walk you step by step in the inferential statistics worksheet. And then below my hypothesis test right here is my written explanation. So it has all the components of my hypothesis test, as well as my interpretation of the results and the so what or the business implications or decisions that I'm going to make for my business. So you can use this as an example of how you would write your original post for a hypothesis test of a mean. Scrolling down, here's an example of a hypothesis test of a population proportion. Recall that a proportion is when we're looking at some characteristic of interest, divided by the total listings. So that's X over N. You created one of these in the last discussion board for practice. In this example, the characteristic that I'm interested in is apartments. Recall that in our Airbnb data, there was a variable called property types, and apartment was just one of the property types available. Maybe you're interested in houses or hotels or something else. So you could do a similar hypothesis test in that way. But for our example here, I'm doing apartments. And the reason why I'm doing apartments is because I'm interested in knowing if this is a densely populated area, an area with a lot of apartments, because more people can live in an area with smaller accommodations like apartments. Again, that would let me know that there are a lot of people or potential customers in that neighborhood. So I'm going to be setting up my hypotheses as an upper tail test. And so you can see here the null hypothesis states that the population proportion is less than or equal to 0.8 in terms of the proportion of apartments. And then the alternative hypothesis, this is the one I'm trying to test for, is that the hypothesized population proportion is greater than 0.8 or 80% of apartments. So this is how I'm going to set up my upper tail test, because this greater than points to the right, points to the upper tail test. Now, if you wanted to be conservative, our hypothesized value could have been 0.5 or 50%, which is a 50-50 chance of it being an apartment or not being an apartment. But I am interested in finding out if Ville Marie is densely populated, so I wanted to use a bigger proportion of apartments, in this case the 80% or 0.8. Since I'm doing an upper tail test, that means my sample proportion from the Airbnb data has to be greater than 0.8. If it's not, then this hypothesis test won't work. And if you recall, when I did my sample proportion in last week's discussion board, I had already found out that the proportion of apartments was 0.93 in Villa Marie. Then I can go ahead and run an upper tail test and I know it'll be okay. If you don't know if what your sample proportion is greater or less than some number, I recommend just doing a two-tail test and making it conservative at the 0.5 for your hypothesized values. And that way, doing the two-tail test, you'll be safe either way, wherever your sample data ends up falling. So if you choose to do a hypothesis test of a proportion, make sure to watch this video here, which will show you how to fill out the inferential statistics worksheet. And then down below here is how I would explain the results of my hypothesis test and the implications for my business. So use this as an example of how you would set up your original post for a hypothesis test of a population proportion. Now, before I end, scrolling down, if I click on the reply here to begin posting my original post, I want to show you right here is the insert math equation. And this is what you can use to create your hypothesis tests. So this under the Greek tab, here's where my mu or my hypothesized population mean symbol is. And then under the relationships tab, this is where the greater than, less than, not equal to signs can be found, and you can use that to insert into your discussion board. In addition, you can just copy and paste from my examples above and paste it right into your post, and then just fix it or edit it to make sure it looks the way you want it to look. You can also attach your worksheet if you want to include your work so that we can take a look at it more carefully. Remember to hit post reply to post your original post into Canvas. And if you have any questions, just let me know.